Catholic guilt gets a bad rap. But I'm going to suggest that the actual Catholic guilt that people are talking about is actually really helpful and really useful in the saving of our soul. I think that what happens is that guilt gets confused with shame. And so in this brief video, I'm going to distinguish the two, define them, and talk about what we do with each of those. I'm Laura Nicola. I'm your faithful therapist. Thank you for being here, learning about shame and guilt with me. So let me just kind of throw out some words at you and see if you think that I'm describing shame or guilt. So let's start with talking about a right or wrong action, something that's good or bad. That's going to be guilt. Let's talk about feeling like I'm a bad person. That's shame. Let's talk about a feeling of embarrassment or mortification or being disgraced. That's shame. Let's talk about a feeling of, I think I did something wrong and I need to go to confession for it. That's guilt. The distinction between the two really can boil down to where the person is in relation to that feeling. What I mean by that is that I think that guilt implies something that I have done, which leads to a guilty feeling if that action was bad. Whereas shame, I internalize that feeling and it leads me to feeling like my soul, is a bad person, or I'm wrong, or I messed up. When it comes to mental health, I think this comes out really prevalent. If I have a mental health diagnosis, there's a lot of shame around having that because of the unfortunate stigma that exists. And so I internalize the mental health condition that I go through, and I say, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I'm having intrusive thoughts, I struggle with OCD, I'm in a conflictual marriage and about to get a divorce. Things like that. Like I internalize it and it becomes about me as a person, and that is something that leads to shame. Whereas if I externalize those mental health conditions from myself, I can make sure that I'm not internalizing shame, and I can make sure that if there's an action related to one of those that is something that's wrong, then there's an appropriate amount of guilt. Let me give you an example. So mental health conditions, just putting this out there, is not something to be ashamed of, and it's not something wrong. It's nothing I should feel guilty for. But let's think of an example. So let's say that I struggle with depression, and instead of internalizing the shame with that and saying, there's something wrong with me, I can't function, and I'm at home and I'm isolated and I can't get out of bed and my life is worthless, I'm creating a narrative about myself that is like shameful. Like I don't want to admit that, but that's not true. That's not appropriate. I want to externalize it. So I want to say, I struggle with depression. I'm having a hard time getting out of bed. I'm feeling a lack of connections. But those action steps aren't something to feel guilty for. Let's say that, I was angry about my depression and I lashed out at my friend and I called her mean names and I was like, you never help me, you never support me, I'm just here all by myself. That action would lead to an appropriate amount of guilt because that's not okay. So the action step that comes from it is what would be needing to be reprimanded or confessed or forgiven, right? But not the feeling itself. It's very, very important when it comes to mental health that we distinguish between being ashamed of it or feeling guilty for it if that leads to an action that is not acceptable. So it's important to distinguish this, as I'm saying, and there's differences that exist for both of them. So what's nice is that guilt can be forgiven, whereas shame needs to be healed. So guilt, and again, the bad rap that Catholic guilt gets is actually such a blessing, because if we do something wrong and we sin and we take a misstep, we can go to confession and we can be absolved of our sins, but that's an appropriate amount of guilt because we should feel badly for something that we've done that's wrong. That's our subconscious, and kind of our moral code, and hopefully, the knowledge of our faith that is really challenging us to right that wrong. So there's an appropriate amount of guilt there. Now, shame needs to be healed because that's something that, again, is like that internal dialogue, that internalization of something's wrong with me. And we believe, as Christians, that we're all children of God. And so there's nothing inherently wrong with us. And so we have to make sure that we're living our lives believing that. I love the story of the woman caught in adultery, chapter John. I have it written down. John chapter 8. Don't have that memorized. Where, she's brought before the crowd for being an adulterer. And Jesus says, "Has anyone condemned you?" And I feel like at that moment, he's asking about shame. He's saying, has anyone shamed you? Has anyone made you as a person feel badly? And then, she kind of goes on and everybody leaves and all that good stuff. But then Jesus leaves her with the words, go and sin no more. And I feel like in that moment, he's talking about guilt. So I think, he's not entirely letting her off the hook, right? He's acknowledging that she sinned by saying, go sin no more, implying that she had sinned. But he's asking her to take on an appropriate amount of guilt by saying, yes, I did something wrong and I need to confess it. I need to change my life from here on out. So the difference, again, is between is something wrong with me that I need to work through? Or is there an appropriate amount of guilt that I need to change my ways for, or confess, or ask for forgiveness from whoever I've wronged? And this is good because there's, again, the bad rap, right? The Catholic guilt, Sometimes I think we misunderstand too what that looks like exactly. Another example of that would be somebody suffering from scrupulosity. They might fall into this, that's a subcomponent of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. But if somebody falls prey into scrupulosity, then they might believe that something that they did was wrong, even when it wasn't. So people kind of attach a morality to a behavior that might not be appropriate. And so that person might be internalizing all of this guilt, which then turns into shame because they think that it's about them as their soul, their personhood, but it's really not. So again, it's really important to be able to decipher between the two. And again, guilt can be forgiven and shame needs to be healed. I love that distinction. So if you're struggling with kind of figuring out, what is what, definitely seek out a therapist, seek out a spiritual director, kind of spend some time in, reflective prayer, just kind of asking yourself about your behaviors, taking ownership and responsibility when needed for the guilt, but also making sure that you're not creating an unworthiness of who you are as a person. I think that's important. And we're blessed, especially as Catholics, in believing in confession and knowing that we can be absolved of those wrongs if we are feeling guilty for something. But the shame can definitely be healed in therapy. Okay, what's the root of that? Where is that feeling coming from? And can we work through that together so that a person can have more confidence, better self-esteem, and live their faith according to what we believe, which is we're all worthy, we're all children of God. So hope this was helpful, the quick distinction between guilt and shame. If there's confusion or questions or comments, love the comments, so leave them below. Also, be sure to subscribe if you haven't for my weekly Saturday videos. And always, I put in my little plug for following me on my other platforms, Facebook and Instagram. So be sure to check those out and send me a DM with other video ideas that you want. I'm trying to hit all the ones that people have asked me to do. So love getting those. And thanks so always for being here, and many blessings.